Hello everyone. Super excited today to have you all here and the amazing conversation lined up. I'm your host Nirav Dave and a warm welcome to Altrusia's global event webinar on workforce identity governance and access management. Today we have eight amazing speakers who will be sharing their knowledge with us. And when I say amazing, I mean it. I would also like to express my gratitude to our premium partners Proof IG and IGO and our gold partner Performanta who made this event possible. And a special thanks to all the media partners. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any question during presentation, please please ask them into the chat box. I'll bring up them in a Q&A session, or if necessary, I'll ask them during the presentation. So our first keynote for the afternoon is a joint presentation on securing hybrid identity delivered by Mr. Paul and Mr. Alastair Cox. Mr. Paul is the Microsoft Service Director for Performanta, and over his 22 years experience, he has focused almost exclusively on identity, leading teams that have transformed organization via a business-first consultative approach and delivered some of the largest technical solutions worldwide, managing millions of identities. With him, Mr. Alastair is the head of the Microsoft Security Consultancy at Performanta. He has extensive practical experience in cloud and cybersecurity strategy and solutions and has spent his career helping organizations across the globe on their journey to a safer future. Alastair holds an NCSC certified Masters in Cybersecurity and is a member of ISC. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to Mr. Paul and Mr. Alastair Cox. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. If you could bring the slide deck up, Paul.
I certainly will.
Are you? Fantastic. So today we're here to talk about providing users with flexibility they demand without compromising security. The truth. Okay, let's start with the truth. Can organizations truly provide users with the flexibility they demand without compromising security? And I can answer that in 3 characters: no. However, the Rolling Stones said it brilliantly. You can't always give your users the flexibility they demand, but you can give them the flexibility that they need. And what I mean by that is, if we look at, for example, I worked with a company where they had a CEO who had his own favorite old iPad. It was a cracked old iPad, but it was an old present from his wife, and he wanted to continue to use it. We got to the point at which that old iPad was no longer secure. It could no longer run the latest operating systems. And as a result, that device wasn't usable. However, that CEO also had a brand new iPad sitting on his desk, a brand new iPad that he'd never used. He could use that iPad, and therefore we were able to give him the flexibility that he needed, but he wasn't able to use it in the way that he demanded. Thanks. Okay, so I'm going to cover this off in 3 areas. First of all, I'm going to look at what employees and organizations want and need. Off the back of that, I'm going to look into the methodology or advised methodology for dealing with that in the modern world. And then I'm going to hand over to Paul to take it into a little bit more detail. So starting off with what users want, what the happy employee is. And before we do that, I want to talk briefly about how the world has changed. And for clarity, I'm not just talking about the changes which have happened as a result of COVID. Way before COVID was happening, there were discussions going on in organizations, in banks, government bodies, Microsoft Google were all carrying out surveys to understand how employees would be able to work in a future world where users can have their own devices, they can do things in their own way, and they're not tied to a specific desk or a specific office. And I suppose that the keys that we've got here are the three ones that I'm going to bring up here are users particularly want to be able to work from anywhere. They know that they've got their mobile devices, they know they've got their laptops, and they want to be able to use those devices wherever they are, whether they're on holiday or whether they're at home. They also want to be able to use their own applications. But last but not least, and this is key, and people want to be able to do their job. They don't want to be restricted by technology and controls. Now, again, I'm going to use an example. There's two examples here. If I use myself as an example, I, within my organization, can work from anywhere. I can use my own device because we've got controls in place to allow that. And I can use a selection of applications that I choose to use as long as they're secure and we use the controls that we want to. However, my neighbor happens to work at a bank. He can't work from anywhere. He can work from home, but if he wants to go on holiday, he cannot work from that remote location because he's locked down. And actually, that's quite nice because that gives him his work-life balance. He also can't use his own device, but he's provided with his devices. And again, so going back to the original premise, we are able users are able to do what users are able to use devices as and when they want to. If I move on to the next slide, Paul. The flip side to this is the happy organization. And by that, I mean, what do organizations want? Because we know what the employees want now. What do organizations want? Well, I suppose the core of a lot of organizations is to minimize cost. And to minimize cost, one of the most expensive resources within an organization is obviously its employees. Therefore, they want to have productive employees. And that segues quite happily, not only in the ability to work remotely, wherever they are, whenever they are, and to be able to do what they need to do as their job, but also to be happy employees, because a number of surveys have been carried out, and it says roughly between 10 to 15% productivity is increased as a result of employees being happy. On the flip side to that, though, we need to think about reputation. We need to think about reputation. Reputation is obviously key to business. It's key to government organisations. We need the trust of the public. We need that public to be happy with the fact that we are a reliable organisation. And therefore, if you could flip to the next slide, Paul, apologies. And therefore, there's this sort of pyramid. You have the employees, and underneath those employees, they have that flexibility that they need and want. But underneath that, when you're doing it within an organisation, it's critical that you have that compliance and security in place to underpin it. So how do we do this? How can you do this? I'm going to be honest, this is a buzzword, but I'm going to bring up zero trust, because zero trust is the recommended approach to a world without boundaries. In about 2003, David Lacey from the Royal Mail envisaged a world where we are now, with people working from anywhere, using any devices, accessing data all over the place. He foresaw that there was an issue that was going to happen. And bear in mind, this was a time of faxes and like flip phones, and there were none of the technologies. Everybody worked in their office. If you wanted to take your work home, you either had a very heavy laptop or you had paper. And so he set up the Jericho Forum in 2003, 2004. And the Jericho Forum led into multiple other organizations. And if we look at sorry, my screen is just frozen. The Jericho Forum led into the Open Group in 2013, and then Google came up with Beyond Core, NIST and Microsoft came up with their own models. But what's key within these models is the fact that there are two key items, and I don't know if you can see it because it's quite small, but the two key items that underpin part of the controls to zero trust are identity and context. Identity, because that is the source of who we are, what device we are, and context, because it's critical that not only do we understand who we are and what we are, but we also need to know where we're coming from, what devices we're using, what we're talking, what medium we're talking via. And therefore, I hand over to Paul now to take this through in a bit more detail with regards to the session.
Thanks very much, Alastair. Excuse me just a second. So, yeah, obviously this is an identity event. So, we wanted to look at, trends and changes in identity and make it particularly relevant to identity. Alastair's mentioned already that the world has changed significantly. This comparison of the difficulties we have as administrators and providers to our users, I think really does contrast how the world has changed. So, in the past, all of the users we would manage, all of the identities we would manage would be employees. But nowadays, it's not just employees, it's partners and customers. As Alastair said, users want the flexibility to bring their own devices, and they want the flexibility to use a multitude of cloud applications. So in the past, we used to just have to secure applications on premises. Now we're trusting third parties with our data and with our applications. And we used to protect the four walls of our organization through a corporate network and through firewalls. But nowadays, people want to work from anywhere using any device. And so the perimeter has completely been eradicated in the traditional sense. And we used to examine threats through looking at local packet tracing and logs, because again, we were looking at who was coming in from the outside, who was hitting our firewall. That was the domain that we were protecting. But now we have signals everywhere. So, the threats and the way that we need to respond to them have significantly evolved. What we recommend with any identity project that we undertake is to begin with the business need. There's a lot of information there, but there's multiple reasons why you would embark on an identity project. Some of those might be around cutting costs, some of those might be around increasing security, and some of those might be around modernization. So I think it's really important to kind of consider the driver for the identity project to make sure that you achieve the optimal outcome. Some of the approaches that we use and some of the recommendations we make with all of the projects that we undertake is really around this identity in the new world. And this isn't that different to identity in the old world. It's just that the cloud now is prevalent and we really need to consider that. But for the longest time that I've been working with identity projects, first and foremost, it's around synchronization of data, establishing those sources of authority, and going right back to the source of that information. So generally for employees, that's a HR system, but often it can be other systems as well. If you define the business requirement through identity management and synchronization rules, and you make all of that information propagate through all of those different systems, then that achieves the optimal outcome. Consider cloud services. So cloud services often have their own databases. I'm talking about systems like Google Cloud and Azure, but again, you need to consider those as child systems, downstream systems, and think about authority and think about where the data originates from and how you are ultimately propagating those systems. When you're engaging with these cloud systems, when you're using those cloud systems, be aware of their own capabilities as well. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about this in a second. But for example, Microsoft and Google have methods to create users from those cloud systems. And as I say, we'll talk in a minute about the identity and how it flows through from on-premises to cloud to those downstream systems. And a particular standard that I'm just going to talk about in just a moment is SCIM. So SCIM is a generic standards-based method for provisioning. So users who are, or companies who are bringing out new cloud-based systems can adopt a generic standards-based method that allow tools like Azure and Google and others to provision directly into those applications. So Skim, how does Skim work? Skim basically is that as an application developer, you will build an endpoint that can be integrated with a Skim compliant client. So what I mean by that is that, Azure or Google or any other service will initiate a web request. If we look at one of those web requests, what you'll notice is they're entirely standards based. So this is JSON formatted data. It's a standard HTTP method, like a web browser would do. It's a post method. And in fact, the only thing that would change in this scenario would be the URL that's being hit here. So if this is some service, this web request will result in the creation of a new user through this method, and you get an appropriate response back. What's very key as well is that the schema is completely standardized. So, for example, as you see down there, the family name and given name, they're standardized attributes. So that means that this request would work against multiple systems. So what that means when you piece it all together and you look at data synchronization is, in this example here, we've got an authoritative source, which might be Workday. There is provisioning methods, to enable Workday to synchronize to on-premises. That could be through any number of identity management tools. And in fact, I've been speaking about Microsoft. Microsoft have inbound provisioning that will allow identities from Workday to be created directly in the on-premises Active Directory. Probably familiar with tools like Azure Active Directory Connect, which will take a copy of the local Active Directory database and synchronize that up to the cloud. And then using something like Skim, the cloud service can create those users in all of the connected downstream systems. So in this example, we've got Dropbox and others that's all receiving a copy of the user account. So when you're approaching projects like this, it's really important to consider the difference between authorization and authentication. So if we take that example of Dropbox might be integrated with Azure Active Directory for its authentication as well. So through this method, a user would go to a web browser, they would try to issue the resource, try to access the resource just here. That resource, that web application knows that it needs to look to Azure for its authentication. So in that scenario here, it asks Azure to ultimately validate the user. So the user logs into Azure at that point, and then through token exchange, the token comes back to the web browser of the user, gets passed back to the web application, and ultimately the user has been authorized and is authenticated. But that's very different to the identity management process that I was just talking about a moment ago. And then the other thing with these projects is to consider things like roles-based access control and attribute-based access control. So these are methods and approaches that you would use to determine, exactly what a user should have access to in order to allow the user to only have access to the functions and applications that they need, and potentially, even access within the applications based upon the job role that they do or attributes of the user. There are a couple of principles. Alastair mentioned zero trust. So, zero trust has a couple of considerations. One of those is to say that, always verify the user. Assume that the user, isn't who they say they are, whatever. Verify that user needs to have access to that resource. Make them re-authenticate, and also, consider the concept of entitlement versus kind of authorization. So it might be that a user has access or should have access to be able to do something to do their job, but it might not be appropriate to leave that access all of the time. So through a process, a user can request through privileged access management to elevate their account and be able to only do that at the appropriate time through some authorization method. So just to kind of circle back around, I'm aware it's a very brief whistle-stop tour of kind of identity in the new world, but Alastair kind of started with that Rolling Stones reference, and we think to be a very cheesy kind of almost a song lyric here. So you can't always give the users the flexibility that they want, but it's our job as administrators to ensure that we walk that line between enablement for the users and security for us as the organization. And we think we can make users happy, productive users and give them the flexibility that they need.
guess over to any questions.
Yeah. So thank you, Paul and Alastair, for giving such a valuable insight on the topic. And I can see no questions right now arising. So we can close it and move on to our next topic.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Cheers. Bye-bye.